This is a start of a series, Women in American History. Harriet Tubman, talk about her today. Susan B. Anthony, Helen Keller, and Amelia Earhart. A couple asked me, well, what happened to Eleanor Roosevelt? Well, we talked about her before, so I had to drop her from the list. Wouldn't do to talk about her a second time. But all of these ladies, you're going from the 19th in through the 20th century, are really raising the stature of women here. Changes in the wind in the world here after the American and French revolutions. Again, I mentioned this in previous talks, these ideas of liberalism, democracy, republicanism, secularism, socialism, nationalism, parliamentarianism. Apparently it's crossing not only color lines, gender lines. Well, why can't women take part in this, right? I mean, and these women that I mentioned, are going perhaps on different routes, but is it all helping the stature of women? Yeah, sure is. I've been giving talks lately on Edward Bernays. How many people are familiar with him? He is considered the father of American public relations, or propaganda, if you want to use that term. He helped sell Americans on the idea that World War I was fought for democracy. He was a nephew of Sigmund Freud. And again, we have to bring in women into this. It's interesting. They get the right to vote when? 1920? Yeah, well, what does it say in the 19th Amendment? Gender will not be a detriment to voting. Well, it's women, all right? And interesting, he gets a job with Liggett Myers, Chesterfield Cigarettes. And he used to be a publicist for opera singers, some of them female opera singers. And he sells the idea that women, that Chesterfield cigarettes are good for your throat. Opera singers say so. Then, get this. George Washington Hill of American Tobacco Company, he sees Lucky Strike cigarette sales. And so what does he do? He buys Bernays. Now Bernays sticks with the female program here, but he comes out with a program that maybe you've seen this, 1929, a slender, good-looking woman in a slinky red dress with a faraway look with a cigarette like this. Maybe you saw this in some of these old magazines. And that women, and get this, since women have the right to vote, women are raising their stature, they call cigarettes torches of freedom. So ladies, there is a downside here of coming out of the shadows. But again, it's interesting how a man here sees this to sell a product. Here, it's cigarettes. Interesting. Fascinating. But Harriet Tubman, and you'll see on that handout that I use a birthday of 1822. That's not etched in stone. Consider that this lady was born a slave, and the records of many of these people who, when they were born, just are not accurate. I used 1822. That comes out of her Army pension records, although some of the pension records, 1820, 1822, 1825. Kate Larson, a historian, said according to midwife records, 1822, on her headstone in Auburn, New York, is 1820. Her death certificate says 1815. Harriet Tubman mentioned 1822, 1820, even 1825. So let's split the difference. I used 1822 because this is generally the accepted date. But that's not etched in stone here. So let's understand that. Her great-grandmother's name was Modesty. And Harriet was told that her rudiments are with the Ashanti people in Africa, which is now Ghana. But there's no way of knowing all this. She is the product of two people, obviously here. Harriet Green, who had a nickname Rit, just like a guy, Rit. Her father was a Ben Ross. Now, Harriet Green was owned by a Mary Patterson Brodess. This is in Maryland, by the way. This is not the Deep South. This is not the Deep South. And Ben Ross is owned by a man by the name of Anthony Thompson, who will later be Mary Brodess's second husband. And the two are interesting. They get married in 1808, and they have 9 children. 5 girls, 4 boys. Interesting, the youngest boy's name is Moses. And that will later on be Harriet Tubman's nickname, Moses. And I'll get into why she's called Moses. People like William Lloyd Garrison, the noted abolitionist, John Brown later called her General Tubman. And they got along very well. So did Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass. Yeah. And she will later, although later she will become a suffragette after the Civil War is over with. So she tries to run the gamut here. But at this time, Harriet Green and Ben Ross, we'll call them married at this point, they're going to have 9 children. Now keep in mind the problem with being a slave family and having children. This is what, 1808 the two get married? You can't bring slaves into the country anymore, but that's irrelevant. Why? Slaves are breeding here. By the American Revolution, it's estimated that there were like 650,000 slaves in this country. So you figure a population of what by 1787? 2.5 million, 3 million people. What? Let's say 700,000 slaves? That's a sizable proportion of the population. Does kind of call into question here, if this country was founded on liberty, then how come 18-20% of its citizens, if you want to use the term citizens, are not free? But by 1808, you can't bring slaves in. But it doesn't make any difference. There's already over 1 million in this country anyway. Just short of the Civil War, there's over 3.9 million slaves. Fascinating when you look at the South here. 9 million people in the South at the beginning of the Civil War. 3.9 and change are slave. That means there's only 5 million whites approximately in the South. And not all of these are men because you have to staff an army and the North has 23 million people. Interesting where this is going to go. But keep in mind, after this point, you get into 1808, 1812, 1820. Keep in mind the country's expanding, right? Sure it is. And slave states, you're going to see states appear like Arkansas, Alabama, how about Mississippi, Louisiana, and we're going to get into Texas. Does that mean the cotton belt is extending? Yes. You need 200 frostless days for cotton. North Carolina is a pretty good place to grow cotton. Maybe not as good as Arkansas or Louisiana or even Texas. South Carolina's okay. Georgia. You need the warmer days. So what does that mean? More slaves being bred here, more slaves being sold. And this had a tendency to break up families. That's the issue here. You could have 9 kids, like Harriet Green and Ben Ross. How many are you going to have by the time they're done selling them off? In fact, the Brodess family will sell off 3 of Harriet's daughters. They're down to 6 kids. At one point, Moses, Edward Brodess, Mary's son, wants to sell the young boy Moses. So what does Mary do? So what does Harriet do? Harriet Green, or Harriet Ross, Mrs. Ross. She begins to take Moses and parse. Keep in mind the setup here. She was hiding her son with other slaves or free blacks. Keep in mind this is Maryland. At one point, half the blacks in Maryland are free. So she's parceling out her son and hiding him in different households. Although one day when Edward shows up to take Moses, Harriet threatens to bash his skull in. You know who witnesses this as a young lady? Actually, Harriet Tubman, Tubman's her married name, but she's not Harriet at this point. Her actual name is Araminta, or Minty as they used to call her for short. She witnesses this. She's beginning to put together that perhaps, just perhaps, resistance works. She's going to get this from two sources. What she saw her mother do to protect her younger brother, who, by the way, will be rescued by Harriet Tubman later and brought north. So she will save her brother later on. But at this point, she gets two sources. She gets two sources to accentuate her passion for resistance. One, by watching what her mother did to defend her younger brother, but also the stories her mother would tell her, biblical stories that she would recite to Araminta. And she began to develop this intense passion for God. By passion, I don't mean she's getting ready to become a jihadist. Don't believe that one. But she has an ardent belief in God. But she gravitates toward the Old Testament, not the New. And the reason being, in the New Testament, there are passages which say, well, slaves ought to be obedient. That's not how this lady is going to develop. She gravitates to the Old Testament. The stories of deliverance. Isn't that a form of resistance in a way? Yeah, sure is. So she gravitates to this. Now, keep in mind that Harriet Ross, Araminta's mother, is the cook for the Brodus family. So she's not even with the children half the time. Araminta has to watch her younger brothers and sisters, and she's only 5 or 6. In fact, Mary Brodus, well, they used to lease or rent their slaves out to fellow plantation owners. And so she rents Araminta out. Now, Araminta's only 5 or 6. She has to watch this lady's baby while the baby's sleeping. The lady's called Miss Susan. And so she's supposed to make sure the baby rests. Well, you ladies know this. Do babies sleep like clockwork? No, they don't. And the baby would wake up. And when the baby woke up like ahead of time or off schedule, Araminta was whipped. And she will carry scars for the rest of her life. She's only 5 or 6. You expect a 5 or 6-year-old to watch a kid who's less than a year old. And so she tries different things to cut down on the discomfort of the whipping. She fights back. She also begins to wear heavier clothes to absorb the shocks. She even runs away for 5 days. This is a 5 or 6-year-old kid. And so the Miss Susan gives the child back to Mary Brodus. And this isn't the only incident. Later on, as she's growing up here, she will be parceled out to a man by the name of James Cook. And Araminta is only 8, 9, 10 years old, and she has to check on the muskrat traps in the marshes. And as she gets a little older, she's driving oxen, working in the fields, helping to cut down trees. One time, she is sent to a general store to pick up supplies. And she runs into a slave who's running away. The overseer sees the slave and yells for Araminta to stop that slave. Well, how's a 12, 13-year-old kid going to stop a good-sized fella? And she says no. So the overseer picked up a 2-pound slab of steel and threw it, intending to hit the male slave, hit her instead in the head. Down she goes like she got hit by Rocky Marciano. She later says, she had a head full of hair here, and she never really had it brushed or combed at this time of her life. And she says she seems to think that maybe that cushioned the blow. But she also says, he fractured my skull. They brought her home. James Cook says, well, I can't use her. So they take her back to the Brodus plantation. She's laid down on a seat for a loom, and she's left there for 2 days without medical attention. And she's back in the fields. Sweat, and she's still bleeding here. But this begins to foster something that's going to affect her for the rest of her life. Every once in a while, she would just want to go to sleep. And she also begins to get visions and dreams, especially of the religious type. Especially of the religious type. Interesting storyline unfolding here. She also understands here that she's eventually going to be sold. But many slave owners will not buy her because of her penchant for sleeping. How can you put somebody like this in the fields? How's that going to work? By 1844, she meets a man who she will marry. John Tubman. John Tubman is a free black. He's not a slave. That's still an issue. Because even if they have any children, the children automatically become slaves. Another issue arises here. Ben Ross, her father, was supposed to be considered free at age 45. Same thing with her mother. Supposed to be considered free at age 45. Keep in mind, by this point, your early 1840s, Mr. Ross is already approaching 55. And the Brodus family had no intention of honoring the original owner's wishes. Harriet Tubman finally gets $5 together and approaches a lawyer. Wants the lawyer to take care of the legal aspects of this so that her parents are free. And on top of that, it's found out, according to this will, that their children would be free. Well, there's roadblocks, stone walls, $5. The lawyer doesn't solve this problem, and they remain slaves. And so it's at this point where Araminta Tubman changes her name to Harriet. Some historians think she did that out of reverence for her mother. There's another aspect to this too. She's planning to escape. So why not at least change part of your name? And so she will try to escape with her brothers, Robert and Henry. Or Ben Jr. rather. Ben Jr. and Robert. And they escape. They're going to leave Maryland, get into, it's the route. It's the Underground Railroad route. Maryland into Delaware, finally Pennsylvania. One problem here. Her two brothers become homesick. And they want to go back. And so Harriet Tubman has no recourse but to go back with them. But her desire to be free is strong. She goes back with her brothers, but in 1849, she will leave. Now what's interesting here is she gets involved with the Underground Railroad. Keep in mind, this is a lady who's not going to who'll go back numerous times back into Maryland to get people out. But as the Civil War comes, this is one aspect of her which I really think is underreported. She becomes almost like an insurgent, a special forces operative. And I'll get to that. It's a fascinating story. But as she is in her first trip with the Underground Railroad, she meets various people along the way. Slaves, free blacks, abolitionists. Now, many of these people who have safe houses for escaping slaves are Quakers. In Maryland, in Delaware, and then getting into Pennsylvania. The whole journey to get into Pennsylvania, like up to Philadelphia, is approximately 90 miles or so. But when you're on foot, and you can't walk during the daylight hours, unless you're pretty good at hiding yourself. And in the daylight, when you're black, that might be a problem. Now, I don't mean to be facetious here, but that might be a problem. The trip took anywhere, depending on how slick the Underground Railroad was, the trip could take 5, 6 days, up to 3 or 4 weeks. One Quaker lady who was shielding Harriet Tubman told her to go out in the yard and work in the yard and have that show that you are my slave. And she did, it worked. But this is a lady who begins to mentally map out this route. She gets to Philadelphia. And keep in mind, other blacks had gotten to Philadelphia too. We're talking 1850, 52, 53, 54, but this leads to a problem for many blacks. Poor Irish immigrants are coming over. Now there's a scramble for low-paying jobs in Philly between escaped black slaves and free blacks and Irish. Keep in mind too, in 1850, the fugitive slave law. To placate the South, any blacks picked up in the North could be sent back. And interesting here, the legislation, police departments. Keep in mind what's going on now with immigration. Aren't there some towns where they won't let their police departments pick up immigrants in accordance to what that current occupant of the Oval Office wants? Go back to 1850, 51, 52, the fugitive slave law, when Northerners had to pick up Southerners, these escaping blacks, and send them back, or be fined.
Is that Dred Scott?
That's, well, no. The fugitive slave law was something a little different than that. But here, however, what happens here? Southern Canada becomes quite palatable for escaping slaves. And so Ontario, because what? The British had what? Abolished slavery? Yes. And so you see many blacks escaping, going not into Pennsylvania, but New York. And then into southern Ontario. And so southern Ontario becomes a mecca, if you want to use that term, for escaping blacks. In fact, later on, William Stanton, remember him? Yeah, he will sell Harriet Tubman some farmland up in Auburn, New York, which has become a hotbed for abolitionists and freed blacks, or slaves looking to hide out. And that will be the family property. Her mother and father will eventually go there, some of her brothers and sisters and nieces and so on and so forth. But people will hide out here. And so what she does is she begins to get odd jobs because she wants to go back and free members of her family. So she will do some jobs, collect money, and then go back down into Maryland. And during the decade of the 1850s, she will make 13 trips. Now keep in mind, a lot of this is on foot. And having done this numerous times, she has a system here. She usually does this in the winter months, when the nights are longer and the days are colder and people don't like to go outside. Interesting how she figures all this out. And she takes chances. She was on a train once, and she sees an overseer that she knew from her days as being a slave, and really thinking quick, she picked up a newspaper and picked it up and put it in front of her face. Now, the thing here is, these slave traders knew that she couldn't read. So, picked up the newspaper, passed her right by. Interesting. She also wound up carrying a revolver with her. This is a lady who's not trying to miss a trick here. But she will go down and bring out members of her family and other people who aren't members of her family. At one time, she gets 11 people out at one time. They even stop at the house of Frederick Douglass, who was a well-known abolitionist, but a freed slave, who was very, very popular as a speaker. And so she does this numerous times, bringing family up to, after they get this property, Auburn, New York. Keep in mind, Stanton, too, was an ardent abolitionist, Stanton is interesting. I think it was him who, when the South seceded, and this is something Abraham Lincoln didn't want to hear. At last, we are rid of those mosquito republics. And that's the last thing Abe Lincoln wanted to hear. And so she's making all and the last trip is one that comes into question here. She went down for a girl. It was supposed to be her niece. Her name was Margaret. Now, this girl was about 8 years old. She was a young light-skinned black girl. And she gets her out, but supposedly, and I don't know if this is quite true or not, supposedly that was a daughter she had with John Tubman. Can't say for sure whether that's the truth, because Margaret's later daughter, Alice, called it a kidnapping. But then again, people who saw the two saw that there were striking features between the two that made it look like that perhaps that was her daughter. That's a murky story. But another story is she went back down to get her husband, John Tubman, out of Maryland. And again, in between trips, she would find a job, make some money, to fund the trip, and down she'd go. She was going to bring her husband back. Come to find out, her husband was already married again. Yeah, he was already married again. And I think he already had a child with his new wife. He didn't want to leave. He said, I'm happy down here. And she was going to make a big scene here, but she decided no. And not to have a wasted trip, because now you think she's coming back empty-handed. No. She found some slaves who wanted to get out, and she let them out. And she led them north. So the trip wasn't wasted in the end. But what she did here, she also, in those 13 trips, it stated that she brought out about 70 people. But not only that, another 50 or 60 she helped get out by not escorting them, but by providing the necessary information along that underground railroad to help them get out. So in the end, it's 120, 130 people that this lady had helped. Interesting end of the interesting aspect of the saga of this lady here. Civil War. Keep in mind too, just prior to the Civil War, she gets to know John Brown. Now keep in mind, at this point, they really don't know down south that it's Harriet Tubman doing this, rescuing all these people. They think it's white abolitionists. They even think it might be John Brown. John Brown, by the way, in 1858, is already planning the Harper's Raid Ferry. And Harriet Tubman will help in the planning of this, by the way. She goes up to southern Ontario, and some of these black men she rescued, and some she didn't, trying to get them to go back down south to form that army to free the slaves. She's also trying to raise money for John Brown. William Lloyd Garrison, who agrees with Brown that the slaves should be free, doesn't quite agree with Brown's methods. Harriet Tubman, who was not really a fan of using violence, but does agree with the overall agenda here. Of course, John Brown is backed by moneyed abolitionists from like Massachusetts and so on and so forth. But she at this time, when John Brown launches his raid in October of 1859, she's not there. There's various stories as to why she wasn't. They thought maybe she was happy, from that getting hit in the head. She was under the weather again, sleeping or having an epileptic fit, which is what one historian said that she wound up with. But John Brown's raid is obviously a failure, and he's hung in December of 1859. Although she said that his basic idea was sound. But of course the war starts 1860. You know, some of these states are seceding in 1860. The war starts in 1861. Now, she thinks that now with the war starting, now's the time. Now's the time. She offers her services, by the way. She offers her services. And with other abolitionists, she's eventually going to wind up in Port Royal, South Carolina. But in the meantime here, you do see a couple of generals here. Interesting what you see here. Interesting what you see. I have it here because I found this fascinating. When the war starts. General Benjamin Butler, who's in command of Fort Monroe, he's a believer in he believes in the abolitionist movement, and he considers blacks who are, let's say, fall into Union hands as contraband. Puts them to work. Later they'll be paid, but he considers this area a free area for these people. General Hunter, David Hunter, who later on is interesting too, because he wants to raise a black regiment in 1862. Ardent anti-slaver. Ardent anti-slaver. Lincoln will chastise General Hunter for doing this in 1862. Keep in mind, Emancipation Proclamation's January 1863. Lincoln at this point is not on that agenda to free the slaves. He wants to put the country back together, but he's not ready to free the slaves at this point. Keep in mind that those who want to free the slaves, they don't want them staying here. They want to shove them back to Africa. Interesting, some of the agendas here at work. That's like that plot against Hitler on July 20, 1944. You know, a lot of stories come out of this, and some good stories about how some of those German officers, they laid their lives on the line to get rid of Hitler. But you know what some of them wanted? Once Hitler was gone, they wanted to get together with the British and the United States and take on the Russians. Interesting here. Interesting here. But she volunteers to go back down south. Now her talent of working behind the lines is going to be very important here. First, she's a nurse, tending Union soldiers, whether it's battle wounds or things like smallpox. And she never contracts smallpox, which lends to this aura that she's been blessed by God from some of the freed slaves. Another aspect of this lady, you know, as she becomes more popular with Union troops, she's given rations and supplies. Well, some of the other freed blacks say now she's getting preferential treatment. You know what she did? She eschewed the supplies, and at night she would sometimes bake pies and sell them. Interesting how this lady acclimates herself to the situation. Fascinating. She becomes very adept. It seems that that area, that shoreline area of South Carolina, really is not all that much different than the eastern shoreline of Maryland. And so she's very adept to working behind the lines. She goes behind the lines and maps out areas in South Carolina for Union troops. She actually goes on some of these excursions or raids with Union troops. The Combahee River, January 1860, June 1863. Again, this is in Jacksonville, Florida. There's a raid here on Jacksonville, near Jacksonville, Combahee River. And her expertise with working behind the lines, she helps lead 3 federal steamers up the river. And federal troops attack various plantations, setting fire to them, burning out the cotton bales, so on and so forth. Blowing up supplies. They're also there to free some of the slaves. And the whistle blasts on the steamers. And all of a sudden the slaves come out. And Harriet Tubman said, I never saw anything like this in my whole life. women carrying babies, men carrying pigs. Some women she saw carrying steaming pots of rice. No one will leave the food behind. And the overseers using whips and firearms trying to get the slaves back in line. They can't. You know why? 750 slaves would cram themselves on these 3 steamers. It's one of the greatest behind-the-lines raids of the war. And they get out. Interesting. That itself is an interesting story. She will continue her work as a nurse, behind the lines, mapping routes, so on and so forth, to the end of the war. And she's really not regarded for this too well, except by the troops on the ground. And it gets lost in the shuffle. In fact, at one point, she's on her way back north. This has shades of Rosa Parks. You know, Rosa Parks wasn't the first one to give up her seat. Not to take anything away from Rosa Parks, that's not the story here. She deserves her place. But Harriet Tubman's on a train going north. The conductor wants her out of the passenger car into the smoking car. And she says no. He says, get out of your seat and get into the smoking car. She says no. And she explains to the conductor what she had done during the Civil War. Well, that means nothing. Even some of the passengers are saying, get up out of your seat, throw her in the smoking car. Finally, he goes to take her out of the seat, and she holds on to the railings of the seat, and he needs help from 2 other gentlemen. They break her arm. And they just take her and throw her into the smoking car. That incident gets out, by the way. And some journalists print this up. It's not very good publicity for the railroad. I don't know what railroad it was. But she finally winds up in Auburn, New York, the family land. And she's gonna get married again in 1868, 1869. And her husband will die in 20 years, and they will adopt a child by the name of Gertie. But she winds up joining the suffragette movement. And she will get to know people like Emily Holland, Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony. She travels and gives talks on the suffragette movement. She was asked one time by some lady, she says, do you really think women will get the right to vote, and do you think they should have the right to vote? And she says, should we have the right to vote? And she relates her experiences from the Civil War. Yeah, we deserve the right to vote. We deserve the right to vote. In her declining years, by the way, she attends many conferences and seminars on the suffragette movement. And then comes the time for her to get a pension. When her husband died, who had been in the Union Army, he was accorded a pension. They will fight for her to get part of that pension in 1895, 1896. However, 2 congressmen, one from New York, one from Wisconsin, will bring up a bill for her to get a pension on her own. She tried a number of times to be recompensed, and it came for naught. And keep in mind, even though they have the family land, so sometimes had money and then she was broke. She had money and then she was broke. She would give money away to various causes, especially like the suffragette movement, and blacks trying to help blacks get along. Till finally in 1899, a bill is passed, legislation is passed, and McKinley will sign it, and she will get a pension of $20 a month from the federal government, having been a so-called nurse to Union troops during the war. She will set aside a plot of land, and it will be a rest home or an old age home, if you want to call it that, for women. And she's going to wind up there after having and interesting too, because she gets an operation on her. She's having problems passing out, and so she will have an operation. And she says what they did, she went through this operation with no anesthesia. And she says they'll slice off part of her skull to eliminate the pressure and then put it back together again. Supposedly without anesthesia. She was biting on a bullet, so the story goes. But she will later contract pneumonia and she will die on March 10, 1913. And she will wind up in the rest home that she helped found in Auburn, New York. The March 10, 1913, that date's pretty concrete here. The date she was born was not. But this is one of these ladies who, and she dies just short of the First World War, 7 years before the women get the right to vote. And she dies, was it 7 years after Susan B. Anthony does? Because Susan B. Anthony will die in 1906. So it's, you know, again, another one of these ladies that comes along that helped to raise the stature of women in this country. And not only in this country, this woman is a beacon for people who want to resist oppression anywhere. Anywhere. She was only like 5'5". I mean, I think she was shorter than Peter Lorre. But again, it shows you don't have to be a 6'6" giant to accomplish great things. Whether it's smuggling people out or working behind enemy lines. That end of her story really fascinates me because that's considered, what, a man's world? Maybe not necessarily so. Maybe not necessarily so. Interesting, when she used to carry a revolver, she was smuggling some people out of Maryland, and this one particular gentleman was getting cold feet. I mean, keep in mind, you're avoiding slave patrols, the police, on your way to doing this. And he wanted to go back, and she pulled the revolver. It's too late for that now. Well, she knew if he went back, that threatens the whole group. And she was willing to shoot him to preserve the group. Come to find out, when they reached safe haven, he was with them. So, yeah. She's an absolutely fascinating character. One of the real giants to come out of the, not in size, but not in physical stature, but really one of the giants to come out of the 19th century American history. Fascinating person. Anybody have any questions or comments? Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I was just wondering, a good part of the story was the communication methods through song.
Yes.
Prayers with the slaves in the field, they would sing to each other. There was a signal of what day and what time and where.
Yeah, and she would and she would sing, and depending on what tone she was singing, yes, it's okay. No, stay put.
I just found that fascinating.
It is fascinating. It's a means of communication, verbal communication, but with song. And they were singing a lot anyway.
Right.
Many of these slaves. And where do you think the blues came from?
Yeah. Exactly.
Right. Now I find that interesting. Many of these, when you talk about the blues, and especially later on in the 30s, you get people like Skip James, people like this. And where do a lot of these white rock guitarists gravitate toward in the 1960s? Like Eric Clapton, Keith Richards, the black blues players. That all comes out of this. Interesting, the evolution of the music itself.
I just wondered if you've heard of, there's a folk group, Kim and Reggie Harris, and they sing a lot of songs about that era.
About that era?
And they have a whole, around, usually in February, Black History Month, they go around school children and sing the songs. They have a whole collection of songs about the Underground.
Bouncing off what you're saying, it's fascinating, the black experience here from being slaves, and as the people begin to coalesce, they begin to acclimate themselves to their situation, and they begin to adapt or adopt white man's religions. Methodists, Baptists, with their spin on it, but that's fascinating in itself. It really is. I mean, there's no way back to Africa at this point, so let's just adapt here at this point. Although, again, going back to what I mentioned earlier, there were some who were against the institution of slavery, but we don't want the blacks here. No. So you had that end of the agenda. But there were many legitimate people, whites, abolitionists, who were against the institution anyway. I mean, it is an abominable institution. In fact, I don't know how many of you know, the slave markets are opened up in Libya again. Yep. Without Gaddafi, the slave market's opened again. Yep.
Do you know how many houses participated in the Underground Railroad
How many houses?
in Connecticut?
I honestly don't know a number, but Connecticut was one of those routes. You know, it's almost like the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, you know, many people think, well, no, it's not just one trail. It's a variety of trails, and the Underground Railroad was the same thing. I know part of it supposedly went through Norwalk.
Well, I once saw one at
Up here.
Stanford. People bought the house and had no idea it was part of the Underground Railroad, but it was.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Where they used to hide them in the basement. Oh yeah, until maybe the next night or two, and then on to the next so-called safe house. Some of these people really took their chances doing this. Yes?
Growing up in Riverside on Club Road, which is off of Riverside Avenue coming down from the Post Road, the road is Club Road and it curves around towards the Riverside Yacht Club. And on the right are two big, very old houses, you know, with the porches going around and stuff. And when I was smaller, when I was a little girl, they showed us the tunnels and the routes that went over to the Mianus River. And then they would cross over the Mianus River, or they would come the other way from Greenwich up to Riverside, Old Greenwich, and go.
Wow.
And my grandmother, who was a suffragette and a nurse and a very progressive woman, who I based my whole life on, she had a huge home that she made into, eventually into a nursing home and a hospice before it was ever done. But as a little girl, I used to spend a lot of time there, and she was very involved and had hiding places. And the one I remember the most was in the fireplace. It was really a big fireplace, okay? And this door in the back would open up. Right. And I used to play there when I was a little girl. It was unbelievable. And she was very involved in it. So the people were very, very strong women who really led the pathway for a lot.
You know, it's interesting too, again, getting back to Harriet Tubman with her second husband, this Nelson Charles Davis was his name, who had been in the Union Army during the war, and he was in from 1863 1865, so he was eligible for a pension, and yes, she will get part of that pension, but the fact of the matter is, Nelson Charles Davis is just one of almost 200,000 black men who served in the Union Army during the war. And it's Frederick Douglass who will say, you know, don't have freedom given to you, go fight for it. It's going to cost them. Make no mistake about that. It's going to cost them. But I always thought that was a fascinating aspect of the war. Almost 200,000. Keep in mind, on April 9, 1865, when the war was over, the Union Army, this is unheard of in North American history at this point. The Union Army is 2,213,000 men. There had never been an army this size in North America up to this point, which scared the heck out of Congress because that's not how the country was founded. And in 2 years, they're going to gut that army, and it's going to be down to 57,000 men. Congress didn't want a large army. They thought it was a threat to the Grand Republic. But the fact of the matter is, almost 200,000 black men in the Union Army. That's almost 10%, 9%. That's a lot. That's a lot. And some Union officers liked blacks as soldiers. Why? Well, they had been slaves. They were used to being told what to do. Irish and Germans, immigrants. Why? They came from Europe. You know, Americans have a tendency of not like being told what to do. And so, like blacks, some of these Irish and German immigrants, where'd they come from? Countries that had authoritarian rule. Gee, they know they're good soldiers. They understand being told what to do. They're great soldiers. And so the South didn't have that. There were some in the South who wanted to arm the blacks. Let's have them fight with us, and in three years after the war, they'll be free men. No. And so they ostracized blacks from the Confederate Army. And so who do some of these guys fight for? The North, as if the North needed more men. So it's interesting, that aspect of the war. But her husband, her second husband, Nelson Charles Davis, had been a Union soldier. And when they got married in 1868-69, he was 22 years younger than her. Yeah. Yeah, good for her, someone just said. Hey, you know, can't keep a good person down here. But he'll die like in 1888, 1889. Her first husband, John Tubman, after Harriet went down to go rescue him and found out he was married again, he will die 16 years later, shot. I think he was shot by a white man in some sort of dispute. But she led an interesting life. There's no doubt about this. She led an interesting life. Interesting life. But again, she's another one of these ladies that we're going to talk about that they're fascinating. Yes, yes, ma'am.
What was the time frame for the story, 12 Years a Slave? You know?
12 years.
The guy, he was a free man.
Right.
He was kidnapped and taken back to the South.
Yeah. That time frame, that escapes me at this point. But there's a lot of stories like that where blacks made it north, but then were picked up and sent back. There's a lot of stories like that.
This guy was born free.
Beg your pardon?
This guy was born in freedom.
Yeah, but even free men were picked up and sent south as slaves, to be slaves. So did the idea of being free totally shield you? No. No. Yes.
Are you aware of what's taught in high school American history these days? Because I'm thinking, how did I, going through high school in the 60s, this was not a name that, unless I slept right through it, this was not mentioned at all. I mean, the history.
A lot of women weren't mentioned.
Right.
Forget Harriet.
It's properly treated today, so I'm wondering, because I mean, she is obviously.
Well, I think
We all need to know.
Yeah, it is, and there are certain aspects. You bring up a good point, because there's certain aspects of American history here that need to be told. Now, look at the point of Harriet Tubman. I mentioned, and again, I find this fascinating. Here's a lady, a black lady, working with federal troops behind Confederate lines. As an insurgent, special forces type, rudimentary, of course. And then again, another aspect of American history that's conveniently forgotten, our revolution. It doesn't start as a revolution, it starts as a civil war. Patriots against loyalists and Tories, those are colonists fighting. We conveniently forget this stuff. Why? I mean, I wasn't taught that in high school or in middle school. I wasn't taught that. Interesting what you find out when you're done. You're out of school. You know?
I just listened to the John Quincy Adams books on tape thing. I should be reading it, but I listened to it in the car. I am just so amazed at what an abolitionist he was. And the story was, I found it just...
John Adams?
John Quincy.
Oh, John Quincy Adams, yeah.
I was fascinated, the way they portrayed it. His presidency was a flop, but when he came back to Congress after his presidency,
Right.
he was just no holds barred abolitionist trying to get slavery discussed, which they didn't obviously.
Well, yeah, at that point in the country's history, you're seeing the country expand. And it's expanding fast. Manifest destiny at this point. And you see, well, is this territory going to be free or is this territory going to be slave? Which impacts slave families, because as this expands, we need more slaves in Arkansas, in Alabama, in Louisiana, Missouri, Texas, whatever the case may be. And so you're going to have to rip children away from their families and send them. I mean, that's horrible. In fact, her three sisters who were ripped away from her mother, who knows what the heck happened to them. And that's not the only family, obviously, here, because you needed thousands of slaves in these new states. And then, of course, Kansas becomes a battleground here. In fact, when we get into Susan B. Anthony, two of her brothers went to bloody Kansas. Her brother, Daniel, I think it was, became a newspaper editor and eventually became the mayor of Leavenworth, while her brother Merritt joined John Brown's gang. And they came out, they were supposed to be Quakers. Wow. Must have been that way out part of the Quaker movement. But yeah, now that's another aspect of this is absolutely fascinating. And so you're right. We don't teach enough of this. Of course, I'll give you that. There's a time constraint, okay. But I think if teachers are given, especially if in certain areas of the country, if a teacher is given more sway on what they can teach in the class, maybe we could overcome some of that. I mean, I talked to a couple of graduates of one of my local high school who thought that the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki came before the attack on Pearl Harbor. You think I'm kidding? My wife and I were invited to a Marine Corps League dinner because our son put 2 combat tours in Iraq as a Marine. And he was invited as an active duty Marine to this Marine Corps League dinner. We had to tell him, well, he's in Iraq. He can't come. Well, why don't you and your wife represent your son? Okay, fine. And so we did. And we were sitting, one of them was a retired Marine colonel, and we were talking about history. I said, well, and his eyes got as big as your glasses. Christmas, you think I stabbed him. And yeah. So it's interesting what they're not taught or what they don't know. Yes?
It's interesting, though, because the Brown brothers in Providence were the biggest slavers of all. They were New England Yankees, but they kept all their offices for that in Charleston because they didn't want their neighbors necessarily in Providence to know that. And the same with the Phillips family, the big Phillips estates. He was
right.
the Lord of the Manor in the Hudson. He was one of the biggest slavers, making the money. I think it was a lot of economics that...
Of course it was.
Which is why we're not, you know, if history's written by the guys who are left and are winners, they're not going to be talking about the black grandfather, the black
right.
sheep grandfather. He's
right.
white. But that's, I think, why it didn't get discussed so much.
No, well, that's, you know, it could be said that perhaps this country's original sin is racism. In fact, you know, if you go back to it, bouncing off what the two of you are saying, in 2 years, 2019 will be the 400th anniversary of the first 20 blacks brought here by Dutch traders.
Right, absolutely.
And that's 1619.
Yeah.
When did the Pilgrims get here?
1620. Yeah.
That's interesting. The timing, of course, those 20 blacks were dropped off at Jamestown.
Right.
So yes, has that been endemic in the New World here for almost going on 400 years? Yes, the slavery. And then it's interesting too when you look, when the war is over, there was the 13th Amendment supposedly abolishing slavery. Does it abolish slavery? If you read it, no, slavery or indentured servitude for issues of criminality. So it really didn't. Read the 13th Amendment. And then you tell me next week whether you think it abolished slavery. Read the terminology here. Because there were people in the 1980s who will come along and see that and then begin to privatize some of the aspects of the prison system. Interesting what you see here, because 40% of the prison population is black, another 20% is Latino. Interesting, the crime rate supposedly, if you read SBI statistics, has gone down over a period of 30 years, 35 years, and yet what happened to the prison population? Why did it go up if crime is going down?
It pays.
Well, yeah, but then again, what happened to a lot of those jobs those people had? Where'd they go? So now you have, now in some of these privatized prisons, it could be state, it could be federal. Some 8%, I think, of the state prisoners are in privatized conditions, and I think it's over like 15, 16% are in federal prisoners are in this condition, where companies like, get this, Victoria's Secrets, AT&T, Best Buy, Walmart, Kmart, Apple Computer are using and farmed out some of their work to these prisoners. And instead of getting minimum wage, they're making anywhere from 17 cents to $1.25 an hour. So yeah, and Jeff Sessions wants to accentuate this. So have we gotten over 1619 and then all that happened in between? You tell me. You tell me. So it's interesting. Go read the 13th Amendment and see the wording here. It really doesn't abolish slavery here. Next week I'll bring my copy of the Constitution. But it's interesting what you read here. It really is. Now, and so, and again too, when you look at this whole situation, when the North occupied the South, right? Reconstruction, they called it. Yeah, you're trying to get the South acclimated back into the country, right? Like Lincoln wanted. He wanted the country whole. And so the election of 1876, that's an interesting election because the Electoral College comes into play here. When Samuel J. Tilden was running against Rutherford B. Hayes. Interesting what you saw with this election. You needed 185 electoral votes to win the White House. Tilden, the Democrat from New York, had 184. He needs one. He needs one electoral vote. Hayes had 165. Well, you had 3 states, and guess where these states are? They are Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. Where do these states come from? The South, right? And each of these states, Democrats and Republicans say our candidate won. Well, you can't win. You can't have an election like this. But Tilden only needs one electoral vote. Sounds like Rodney Dangerfield in those light beer commercials when they were bowling. Hey, Rodney, we need 1 pin here. And he throws it in the gutter. And so, by rights, this should have been thrown back into the House of Representatives. It's not. Southern and Northern politicians will get together. And the Southerners say, hey, look, we'll let you have Hayes in the White House, but you get Northern troops out of the South. That's called the Compromise of 1877, and federal troops were pulled out. What happened to blacks after that?
Jim Crow.
KKK, so on and so forth. And so were blacks truly free? No. Of course, I don't think the North helped the situation when in some respects they had black men in blue uniforms patrolling the South prior to that. Talk about rubbing the salt into it. Interesting here. You know who else does the same sort of thing? In January 1921, when the Germans told the British and the French, we can't pay the reparations. So the French occupy the Ruhr, one of the industrial heartlands of Germany. French and some Belgian troops. You know what the French sent? Some of their troops from their colonies who were black. That made the Germans real happy. Interesting. Wow. Somebody understood history here.
Yeah.
Talking about not understanding history. Somebody did. The French. And that'll make them real happy. So it's interesting what you see when you begin to peel off the layers here, what you find. But read that 13th Amendment. You might fall off your chair. You think, oh, slavery's abolished. Really? Really? Interesting what you see here. Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Yes, ma'am.
Isn't it true that the blacks didn't have a real vote, like 3 guys equal 1 vote, or something like that?
At one point, the North. Keep in mind, the North has all the advantages here, and so to placate the Southerners, it was allowed that blacks are not considered human beings. They're what, property? And yet, Southern representatives could count blacks as three-fifths of a person for a voting total. Now, but talk about having your cake and eat it too. In fact, in 1826, there was a Pan-American conference, again, talking about this side of slavery, so on and so forth. And these burgeoning republics down in Central and South America were going to have a conference in Panama. And the British sent observers to this conference. The British government did. America wanted to send observers here, but the South filibustered. Why? Because these republics had outlawed slavery. Now, we don't want to support that, do we? By the time northern politicians overcame the filibuster, they sent 2 reps down there. The conference was over. Britain inked trade deals with these new republics. We got, yeah. Well, that was the same thing when Haiti, Toussaint Louverture, 1804 revolution. They didn't want that trumpeted too much down south. Not at all. So, interesting how history is, again, contorted, forgotten, whatever. Interesting here. Yes, ma'am?
Isn't Harriet Tubman supposed to be replacing Andrew Jackson?
Supposed to be on the $20 bill.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, but is that not happening now, or?
Ask Steve Bannon.
I thought Mnuchin was the
Or Mnuchin. You know. But yeah, supposedly, at one point, remember when they had the Susan B. Anthony dollar?
Yeah.
Remember that? Yeah. Anybody still have any of those? Yeah, I have a few of them. Okay, I
Close to the quarter.
beg your pardon?
Too close to the quarter.
Yes. Yes.
Confused.
Yes, they did. Yeah, many people did.
People
Yes.
didn't want
Beg your pardon?
them. People didn't want them.
No. No. I mean, I saved some of them. I wasn't. In fact, whenever I got them, I never spent them. I said, yeah, I'll hold on to them. Glad I did. Glad I did. But interesting here. Yes, ma'am.
Without going through a lot of detail, but your time, who's Emily Holland?
She was I don't know that much about Emily Holland. She was a well-known suffragette of the era.
She descended from Jonathan Harlan.
That I honestly don't know. But that's a good research project.
Yeah.
Good research project. But again, Harriet Tubman is another one of these, as I mentioned earlier, one of these ladies like Susan B. Anthony and then Eleanor Roosevelt, who were raising that stature of women. But again, go back to the American and French Revolution with these ideas of the age of reason and enlightenment put into action. So why can't women take part in this? I mean, if we're liberalizing society, are women supposed to remain in bondage or second-class citizens or whatever the case may be? No. And so you get women like this latching onto this and raising in various guises. And it's fascinating to see. It really is. And it's a long struggle. It doesn't, going back again to history, many pertinent changes do not happen right away. It takes time. It takes time. And so, but I still say the 2 of the biggest things that helped women were World War I and World War II. Because you've seen, again, war. And why war? Because now we're in the age of the Industrial Revolution, and wars had become so vast because there's more factories, oil comes along, and so with more factories and weapons able to reap a greater harvest of humanity, we need more bodies. And if we need more bodies, we need more bodies to fill the factories. Women. And so women, again, World War I, but more important, World War II. Rosie the Riveter? Millions of women were working here. And so by 1945, it's kind of late to say, okay, ladies, the deal is off, back to the kitchen. Kind of late for that. Despite the fact many women remained housewives, I'll give you that, but as the economy expands, we can no longer have a one-wage earner economy anymore. It becomes what? Right. So those were big spurs here. In fact, Eleanor Roosevelt will say it's a good thing for women, no matter their status in life, to work for a short time in a factory. Interesting. In fact, it's absolutely fascinating here. Absolutely fascinating. These women who are coming up. And again, they get the short shrift. They do. They do.
Remember, they had to leave the farms in the 19th century because they were starving to death.
Correct.
The women, they were really important in the beginning of the labor movement.
Right.
And Lowell and Lawrence and Faith.
And Susan B. Anthony gets involved in that.
Did she?
Yes. And I'll get into that when I talk about her. But she gets involved in the labor movement.
The fathers didn't want them off the farm. I mean, they just
No.
don't feed them anymore.
Well, it's like anything else. Well, it's still male dominance. We don't want these people becoming we want them to remain deaf, dumb, and stupid. But, but women are becoming better educated. They're becoming more professional. Okay, so it changes society, big deal, move on. And it's interesting too, because when you look at Syria right now, Mr. Assad, who a lot of people here don't like for a variety of reasons, who would you rather have in Damascus, Assad or the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda? Because if that ever happens, what happened to the advances of women in Syria? You could say whatever you want about Saddam, women were liberated. Of course, there are prices to pay for this with Saddam, I understand that. But women were educated, had jobs, so on and so. Teachers? Yeah, because they were secular. So, interesting. Fascinating here. Every society has a downside. I don't care what or who it is. But again, you see the same sort of thing happening here. Women becoming educated, women taking their place in society and taking their place in the economy. It changes the country. And rightfully so. Rightfully so. So, but especially when you get into somebody like a Harriet Tubman and Amelia Earhart, who we're going to end up here with. Of course, the fascinating aspect about the Amelia Earhart story, there's no closure. And I know there's been a mountain of stories. Well, she wound up here. The one that really got me is the one that story began to float, that she wound up as one of the ladies who was Tokyo Rose. Yeah, you think I'm kidding? Tokyo Rose. Unbelievable. Well, again, there's no closure, so people sometimes latch on to certain stories, but anyway, my feeling is she was about 20,000 feet down, so that's the most plausible end of this. So, but anyway, but still, there's no closure here. So, otherwise, that's about it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.